On a Tuesday morning in late October, in a town called Lacombe, Alberta, a 53-year-old woman sat at her late mother's kitchen table and looked at the number on her phone screen. Her bank balance, $211.47. She looked at it the way you look at a word you have spelled wrong your whole life and only just noticed. Not with panic, with a kind of tired disbelief that had moved in so slowly she had not seen it arrive. Her name was Vivian Holt. 6 months earlier she had been Vivian Holt Crane. The Crane part belonged to a man named Stewart, and Stewart had taken it back along with the savings account, the Toyota, and 30 years of what she had believed was a shared life. The lawyer had called the settlement fair. Vivienne had nodded because she no longer trusted her own definition of fair. She had come back to her mother's house in Lacombe because there was nowhere else to go. Her mother had died the previous spring, and the house was hers now, a narrow 2-story on a back street, with a leaking eaves trough and a garden nobody had tended in 2 years. She had also inherited, according to the executor's letter, a second property, a piece of land at the edge of town on the banks of the Blindman River. The land held a grain elevator that had not operated in at least 15 years. The letter described it plainly: no assessed value, no commercial use classification, significant structural deterioration. The town had flagged it as a potential demolition liability. Vivian had put that letter at the bottom of a pile of papers on the kitchen table and had not touched it since. She was a bookkeeper, had been for the better part of 25 years. She understood numbers the way a carpenter understands wood grain. She could look at a balance sheet and know within 30 seconds where the rot was, and the numbers in front of her right now told a story she did not need a second opinion to read. $211.47. The house needed a new furnace before December. Her only client had just moved their accounting in-house. Stewart had paid nothing that was not compelled by the court order, and even then he paid late. She was starting over at 53 with her mother's winter dishes and an elevator nobody wanted. Outside the kitchen window, the October sky pressed down flat and gray over the rooftops, the kind of prairie sky that does not promise anything. She poured a second cup of coffee, looked at the papers on the table, and pulled the executor's letter out from the bottom of the pile. Lacombe Grain Elevator, Lot 14, River Road. No assessed value. Her father had built that elevator, Harold Holt. He had died when Vivienne was 19, a heart attack in the cab of his truck on a Thursday afternoon in January. She had not thought about the elevator in years. It had simply been there, the way the Blindman River was there, part of the geography of a place she had left and half forgotten. Her mother had never sold it, never spoken about selling it, which Vivienne had always assumed was simple sentiment. Her mother kept things. She kept Harold's tools in the garage. She kept his winter coat on the hook by the back door until the fabric went thin. She was a woman who did not let things go, even things that no longer served any purpose. Vivian put the letter down and drank her coffee and thought about a furnace and a client, who had moved their accounting in-house and $211.47 and did not let herself think about the elevator at all. She told herself she would go look at it on Friday. She went on Wednesday. The road out to the elevator ran along the river, a gravel track that the city had quietly stopped maintaining sometime in the late 90s. Vivienne's mother's old Buick bumped along it with the long-suffering patience of a car that has outlived its dignity. The poplar trees along the river had gone gold, most of the leaves down now, the branches making their gray pencil lines against the sky. The smell of the Blindman came through the cracked window, cold mud and river grass and something mineral underneath, the smell of water running over limestone. She had not been out this way since her father's funeral. The elevator appeared at the end of the track, the way old things appear when you have been away a long time. Both smaller and larger than memory. It stood about 40 feet high, the original wooden cribbing of the walls gone silver gray with the years, the peaked roof patched in 3 places with sheet metal that had rusted through at the seams. The small attached office building at its base had lost 2 of its windows to weather or vandalism, the opening stuffed with what looked like old feed sacks. The sign above the office door, Holt & Sons, was still legible but barely. The S had peeled away from Sons. Holt & Son it read now. Vivian stood in the gravel and looked at it for a long time. She noted, the way a bookkeeper notes a discrepancy in a ledger, that the elevator itself was structurally upright. It leaned perhaps 2 degrees off true, but the main cribbing was intact, the foundation visible at the base and solid. A careless man does not keep a building plumb. Her father had built this to last, and it had lasted, even through years of nobody caring about it. She tried the office door. It was locked with a padlock she did not have a key for. She walked around the building once, her boots going through the long grass that had grown up around the foundation. She looked in through one of the open windows. She could see old wooden shelving, a calendar on the wall, a metal desk with a green lamp still sitting on it, the kind of desk that nobody makes anymore. On the floor beside the desk she could see the corner of what looked like a wooden file cabinet, the kind with the deep drawers made for hanging folders. The kind her father had used. She looked at that cabinet for a moment, then went home. She told herself there was nothing in there worth seeing. She came back the next morning with a bolt cutter, borrowed from her neighbor Ray, and a flashlight, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who has learned that the things she avoids are usually the things she needs to understand. The inside of the elevator smelled of old grain and machine oil and dry wood and time. The flashlight beam moved through the dust and she stood still, letting her eyes adjust, and something happened in her chest that she had not expected. It was not grief exactly. It was more like recognition. She had forgotten somehow that she used to come here as a child. She had forgotten that her father let her sit on the tall stool beside the desk while he did his paperwork. She had forgotten the sound of grain going up the leg, that rhythmic mechanical sound she had thought nothing of as a child and had simply filed away as the sound of her father's world. She had forgotten a great deal about her father. She had been 19 when he died. She had not had enough time with him to know him as anything other than her father, which is to say she had not yet known him as a man. She was beginning to understand that she was about to be introduced. The file cabinet was locked, but the lock was the old wafer kind, and her father's key ring, which she had found hanging on a nail inside the office door, had 7 keys on it. The third one worked. The top 2 drawers held what she expected: tax records, maintenance logs, invoices for grain handling equipment going back to the 1970s. She skimmed through them with the quick eye of a bookkeeper and set them aside. The bottom drawer was different. It held no folders. It held notebooks. Not accounting ledgers, but ordinary composition notebooks, the kind with the black and white marbled covers, the kind she had used in school. There were 11 of them, stacked flat. The earliest date on the spine was 1974. The most recent was 2001, the year before her father died. She lifted the top one out and opened it at the kitchen table that evening, under the lamp, and she read her father's handwriting for the first time in over 20 years. Harold Holt had small, careful printing, not cursive. He had learned to print in a one-room school in rural Manitoba, and he had never trusted cursive to be legible enough. Every entry was dated, and the entries were not about grain. The Kowalski boy came in this morning, just 16, looking for work since the farm sold. No openings on the floor. Sent him to see Ray Dempster at the feed mill. Ray owed me from the spring. He took the boy on. Good kid. Didn't want to say so in front of him because a boy that age doesn't need to be told, needs to be sent somewhere useful. Vivian read it twice, then she turned the page. November 12, 1974. Mrs. Thibodeau came asking whether we could hold her husband's grain check until January, because if she cashes it in December, she'll lose the family allowance for the month. Held it. Didn't tell anyone because it's her business, not anyone else's. She turned another page. February 1975. A man came in off the highway, truck broken down, no money, 3 kids in the cab. I don't know his name and he didn't give it. Fed them from my lunch and called Gord at the garage on Main to take a look at the truck. Told Gord I'd settled up with him on Friday. About $40. Worth it. Vivian set the notebook down. She picked up the second one. She read until midnight. This is the moment in the story, and we want to make sure you understand what Vivian was reading. Because what Harold Holt had kept in those 11 notebooks was not a diary. It was not a record of his feelings or his opinions or his business decisions. It was a record of people, names and dates, and short, careful notes about what had happened and what he had done about it. There was a woman whose husband drank, and Harold had quietly arranged for her grain check to be directed to a separate account at the bank in her own name. Something that required him to call in a favor from the bank manager he had known since childhood. There was a young farmer who had planted into a drought year and was going to lose everything, and Harold had extended credit through the elevator at 0 interest and recorded it in the notebook rather than the ledger, because he did not want the man to feel the weight of a documented debt. There was a teenage girl who showed up 3 Saturdays in a row, always alone, always sitting on the old bench by the river at the back of the property. and Harold had simply left coffee and a sandwich on the bench each time, and never once gone out to ask why she was there. Because, he wrote, sometimes a person needs a quiet place more than they need a conversation. He had never told anyone. He had never kept these records where anyone would find them easily. He had kept them at the bottom of the third drawer of a locked cabinet in the building he knew his family would inherit. Which meant he had kept them for the same reason a man leaves letters he cannot send. Because some things need to be written down even if no one reads them, and because the writing of them was a kind of promise to himself that he had not wasted his time on this earth. There was an entry from 1988 that stopped Vivienne's breath. September 15, 1988. Viv had her first day of university today. Drove her to Edmonton myself because I didn't want her to take the bus. Didn't tell her I had gone to the bank on Thursday to make sure the first year's tuition would clear. She thinks her mother and I had saved it. We had most of it. The rest I borrowed against the equipment and paid back by spring. She doesn't need to know. She would worry. She worries the way her grandmother worried, which is to say with her whole body. She doesn't need the weight of that on her first day. Vivienne pressed her hand flat against the page. She sat that way for a long time in her mother's kitchen, the lamp making its small yellow circle, the October wind pulling at the eaves trough outside. She had not known. She had gone to university believing the money was simply there. The way money is simply there when you are 19 and trust the ground your parents stand on. She had never known about Thursday at the bank or the equipment loan or the spring repayment. She had never had the chance to say thank you. She thought about 30 years of a marriage she had believed in, and a husband who had quietly dismantled it while she was not looking. And she thought about her father, who had quietly built things while she was not looking. And the difference between the two kinds of quiet sat in her chest like a stone and like a lamp at the same time. She did not sleep. She went through all 11 notebooks over the next 4 days. She read them the way she would have read a set of books that had been kept wrong for decades, carefully, looking for the pattern. What she found was not what she had expected. She had expected, she realized, to find her father's life explained. What she found instead was that his life had not needed explaining. It had only needed reading. The notebooks covered nearly 30 years. The entries were not daily. Sometimes weeks went by with nothing. But the entries that were there were never trivial. He wrote nothing down that did not matter. A young man talked out of leaving town by a single conversation Harold had started about river fishing and maintained for 2 hours without ever acknowledging what was actually happening. A family flooded out of their house on the river flat, given the use of the elevator's upper loft. For 6 weeks the building's electrical run off an extension cord Harold had rigged from his own power account, which he paid himself and told no one about. A boy of 10 who came in crying one afternoon because another boy had taken his bicycle. And Harold had sat down on the floor of the elevator with him, which must have been remarkable for a man of 50, and talked to him until the cryings stopped, and then walked him home. And the next day when the boy came back, Harold gave him a job sweeping up grain that paid 50 cents a week, not because he needed a sweeper, but because the boy needed something that was his. There was an entry from the last notebook dated March 2001, 7 months before Harold died, that Vivienne read 4 times. I have been thinking about what this place is worth. Not in the way the assessors think about it. Their number for this building is probably nothing by now. Which is fine, because their number has nothing to do with it. The river doesn't have a number either. But the river has kept a few people from drowning, and this elevator has done the same in its own way. And if you had to choose between a number and a name, you would always choose the name. I hope whoever ends up with this place after me understands that. I hope they read the notebooks. I'm leaving them in the third drawer on the left-hand side. He had known she would find them. He had written directly to whoever would come after him, not knowing it would be his daughter, not knowing it would take her 23 years to get there, but knowing that someone would come, and that they would need to understand what this building was before they decided what to do with it. She sat in the office for a long time after she read that entry, looking out through the broken window at the Blind Man River, running gray and cold through the willows. 3 weeks after Vivienne found the notebooks, a man named Desmond Yarker came to see her. He arrived at her mother's door on a Monday morning, in a silver SUV that had never met a gravel road until the driveway of this particular house. He was in his mid-40s, pleasant-faced, wearing a fleece vest with a small corporate logo she did not recognize. He had a business card. Yarker Development and Land. He said he had heard through the town that she had inherited the River Road property. He said he was sorry for her losses. Then he laid a number on the table, $70,000. Cash offer quick close, as Vivienne looked at him across her mother's kitchen table. $1,000. She thought of the furnace. She thought of $211.47. She thought of the heating bill coming in December, and the client she no longer had in the 53 years that had brought her to this particular morning. Desmond Yarker had the calm of a man who has made this kind of offer many times and knows what it does to people who need money. He was not unkind. He was simply certain, and his certainty was built on arithmetic, which Vivienne understood perhaps better than he expected. He explained the plan. His company wanted to develop the river frontage. A boutique commercial development, he said, restaurants, a small hotel, high-end retail. The grain elevator was a liability, he said, a demolition risk. He said the town was actually very supportive of the vision. He said this with the ease of a man who has had the right conversations with the right people. Then he said something that did not sit right. He said the property in its current state served no purpose for the community. He said it was simply an old building holding on to land that could be doing a great deal more. He said this kindly, the way you explain something to someone who has not thought it through. Vivienne thanked him for coming and said she needed time. He left his card and drove his silver SUV back down the gravel road, and she stood at the kitchen window, watching it go, and thought about the word purpose. No purpose for the community. She thought about the Kowalski boy sent to the feed mill. She thought about Mrs. Thibodeau's check held until January. She thought about the family in the loft with the extension cord. She thought about a teenage girl who had come 3 Saturdays in a row to sit on the bench by the river. And the coffee and sandwich left there by a man who understood that sometimes a quiet place is worth more than a conversation. She thought about what Desmond Yarker meant by purpose, and she thought about what her father had meant by the same word, and the two meanings were so different they barely shared a language. She did not call Desmond Yarker back that week. She went instead to see a woman named Agnes Bellafouille, who had been her mother's oldest friend, and who now ran the local Historical Preservation Society out of a room above the pharmacy on the main street. Agnes was 71, small and precise, with the particular alertness of a woman who has spent decades noticing things other people overlook. Vivienne brought the notebooks. Agnes read 3 entries standing up in the middle of her office, and then sat down without looking for a chair, landing half on the arm of it, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "I knew your father did things. I didn't know he wrote them down." She asked if she could keep the notebooks for a few days. Vivienne said yes. What Agnes Bellafouille found in those notebooks over the following week was something that Vivienne, reading alone in her mother's kitchen, had not known to look for. Agnes had lived in Lacombe her entire life. She knew the names. She knew which ones were still here, and which ones had moved away, and which ones had children who were still here, and she began quietly to make phone calls. The first person who came to see Vivienne was a man named Oliver Kowalski, who was now in his mid-60s and ran a small trucking company out of Ponoka. He came on a Saturday afternoon, parked his pickup behind the house, and stood in the kitchen with his cap in his hands, and said that Ray Dempster at the feed mill had given him his first job, because Harold Holt had called in a favor, and that first job had been the thing that kept him in the county when he had been about to leave, and that he had built everything he had from that one phone call he had never known about until Agnes called him on Tuesday. He stayed for an hour. He drank 3 cups of tea. Before he left, he asked Vivienne what she was going to do with the elevator. She said she did not know yet. He said he would like to know when she decided. The calls kept coming. A woman whose mother had been Mrs. Thibodeau, and who cried on Vivienne's phone for 10 minutes because she had grown up knowing her mother had been protected by someone, and had never known who. A retired schoolteacher who had been the teenage girl on the bench by the river in 1983, and who said she had never told anyone about those Saturdays, that she had told herself for decades that maybe she had imagined the coffee and the sandwich appearing, and who sat in Vivienne's mother's kitchen and held one of the black and white notebooks in both hands and did not speak for a while. The retired teacher's name was Marlowe Duchesne. She was 63 now, taught school for 30 years in 3 provinces, had grandchildren. She said that those 3 Saturdays in 1983 had been the worst 3 weeks of her life. That she had been 17 and had run out of reasons, and had needed somewhere quiet to sit and not be asked to explain herself, and that the coffee and the sandwich which she had never seen appear and had never seen anyone bring had felt like the world leaving a door open for her. Just that, a door left open. She said she had driven past that elevator 100 times in her life since then. She had not known whose it was. Now she did. We want to stop here for just a moment. If a story like this means something to you, if you believe that the quiet things, the phone calls made, the sandwiches left, the doors held open, deserve to be remembered and told, please take a second right now and subscribe to Ultra Stories. Leave us a comment and tell us where you're watching from, anywhere in the world. It helps stories like this reach the people who need to hear them. Now let's go back to Vivienne, sitting in her mother's kitchen with 11 notebooks and a business card, and a furnace that still needed replacing before December. The morning Desmond Yarker came back, he brought a lawyer. His name was on the bottom of a thick file of documents he laid on the kitchen table, with the smooth efficiency of a man arranging a transaction he considers already complete. The lawyer explained that the town's development committee had passed a preliminary motion supporting the River Road project. He explained that if Vivienne chose not to sell voluntarily, there were mechanisms. He used the word mechanisms, through which the municipality could compel a sale at assessed value. The assessed value, as she was aware, was 0. He said this gently. He was not threatening her. He was simply making sure she understood the full picture. Desmond Yarker, sitting across the table from her, said he thought $70,000 was a more than fair outcome for a property with no commercial future. He said he genuinely hoped she would take it. He said he understood this was her family's history, and that was meaningful. But that the practical reality was that an old elevator with no operating capacity was more of a burden than an asset. Then he made the same mistake the man in the polished truck had made, which is to say he said the wrong true thing. He said that honestly, in his experience, properties like this one had outlived their usefulness. He said it the way a person says something they have believed so long it no longer occurs to them to question it. Vivienne looked at him. She thought about outlived their usefulness, and she thought about Marlowe Duchesne holding a notebook in both hands in this kitchen, and she thought about Oliver Kowalski standing with his cap in his hands, and 30 years of a life built on one phone call Harold Holt had made without telling anyone. She thought about her father sitting on the floor of the elevator with a 10-year-old boy who needed something that was his. She said she needed a few more days. That evening she called Agnes Bellafui and asked a question she had been turning over for a week. She asked whether there was any legal mechanism, any formal structure, that could protect a property like the elevator from redevelopment in a way that a single family could not do on their own. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "As a matter of fact, that is something I have been wanting to talk to you about." What Agnes knew, and what she had been waiting for the right moment to say, was that the Lacombe Historical Preservation Society had been looking for a permanent home for a community archive project for 3 years. The town had 2 or 3 old agricultural buildings on its heritage list, but none of them had both the structural integrity and the river access that made the elevator unusual. She had also in the past 10 days made 17 phone calls, and several of the people she had called had asked the same question Vivienne was now asking. What can we do? And Agnes, who had spent 40 years noticing things other people overlooked, had spent the past week finding out. The answer took the form of a meeting in the back room of the pharmacy, attended by Agnes, Vivienne, a property lawyer named Sandra Fawkes, who did heritage work on a volunteer basis, Oliver Kowalski, Marlowe Duchesne, and 4 other people whose names had come out of Harold Holt's notebooks. Sandra Fawkes laid out the structure plainly. A heritage designation application to the provincial registry, a community land trust, a formal covenant, registered against the title, dedicating the property to historical and community use in perpetuity. It could not be condemned for private commercial development. It could not be transferred to a hotel or a restaurant or a boutique retail development. It could only be what it was and what it had always been, a place that served people. Sandra Fawkes looked across the table at Vivienne and said, "The designation needs to be applied for, and it needs a sponsor. The application is strongest when it comes from someone with demonstrable family connection to the property." She paused. "Your father built that building. You inherited it. The connection doesn't get more direct." Vivienne thought about Harold Holt sitting on the floor with a 10-year-old boy. She thought about the extension cord rigged from his own power account, She thought about the entry dated March 2001. I hope they read the notebooks. I'm leaving them in the third drawer on the left-hand side. He had known. Not this meeting exactly, not this table, not Sandra Fawkes and the heritage application. But he had known, in the way that careful people know, that one day someone would come with a number and a vision and a set of mechanisms, and that the only way to stop them was to have already built something they could not buy. He had spent 30 years building it, one name at a time, in 11 black and white notebooks in the bottom drawer of a locked cabinet. Vivienne signed the heritage application that night at her mother's kitchen table. The next morning she drove out to the elevator and stood in the office for a while. She looked at the green lamp on the metal desk, the calendar on the wall, the deep drawer still open from the first day she had come with the bolt cutter. She looked at the river through the broken window, the blindman running low and cold now in November, the willows along the bank gone bare. She thought about what this building had been, not what the assessors said it was, what it actually was. Desmond Yarker came back one more time. He brought the lawyer again and a thicker file. He laid the new documents on the table in the office and began explaining the expedited municipal process, with the patience of a man who believes that patience, applied with enough consistency, will eventually produce the answer he wants. Vivienne let him finish. Then she took a single document from the inside pocket of her coat. A letter from the Alberta Historic Resources Foundation, acknowledging receipt of a heritage designation application for the Holt elevator, Lot 14, River Road, Lacombe. Attached to it was the first page of the Community Land Trust Covenant, with Sandra Fawkes' signature and the trust's registered number in the upper corner. She set it on top of his file. Desmond Yarker's lawyer picked it up. He read it. He read it again. He said something quiet to his client, and Vivienne watched the confidence change in Desmond Yarker's face. Not dramatically, not in one moment, but like a room going dark when the lamp is moved. He tried several angles over the following 20 minutes. He was thorough. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had built his entire understanding of value on a single premise, that everything can be converted into its dollar equivalent. And he was standing in a room full of evidence that the premise was wrong, and he did not quite have the equipment to process it. He asked, finally, the same question a man in a polished truck had once asked a woman at a river landing. He asked why. Not rudely, almost sincerely. He said he genuinely could not understand why a woman in her position would walk away from $70,000 to keep an old building. Vivienne looked at the green lamp on the desk. She looked at the deep drawer standing open. She thought about a man sitting on the floor with a 10-year-old boy. She thought about coffee on a bench by the river on 3 bad Saturdays in 1983. She thought about what her father had written in March 2001. She said, "My father spent 30 years keeping a record of the people this place helped. I only found it last month. I didn't know him as well as I thought I did, and I am not going to let someone pour concrete over the place where he kept his ledger." She paused. Then she said, "You told me this property had no value and no purpose." My father disagreed, and between the two of you, only one kept the evidence. Desmond Yarker did not answer. He gathered his documents. He drove away, and the silver SUV disappeared down the gravel road and did not come back. Winter came early to Lacombe that year, the first snow arriving before the heritage designation was finalized, which made Vivienne nervous until Sandra Fawkes called to tell her that the application had been flagged as a priority file, due to the community trust component, and that preliminary protection applied from the moment of receipt. The elevator was not going anywhere. Oliver Kowalski came out on a Saturday in November with 2 men from his trucking operation, and they replaced the broken windows and patched the worst of the roof seams, and did not take any payment. He said his father would have called it settling up. Marlo Duchesne organized a small group of her former students, 3 of them now adults, with children of their own, to clear the grass from around the foundation before the freeze. She brought a thermos of coffee and set it on the old bench by the river, and when Vivienne saw it there, she had to stand still for a moment with her back to everyone. Agnes Bellafui catalogued the 11 notebooks herself, with the care of a woman who has spent decades understanding what documents mean. She made archival copies and stored the originals in acid-free boxes. She said the notebooks were the heart of the designation application, that they constituted a documented record of community service, spanning 3 decades that the provincial reviewers had described, in their preliminary notes, as unusually substantive. The heritage designation came through in February, The community trust was formally registered in April. The Holt Community Elevator, as it was officially named, opened its doors on a Saturday afternoon in late May, when the Blindman was running full, and the willows had gone green again, and half of Lacombe, it seemed, had found a reason to drive out along the river road. Vivian stood in the office, the green lamp on, the third drawer closed now because the notebooks were in their archival boxes. But the cabinet stayed where it was, because some things belong in the room they were made in. People came through all afternoon. Some of them she knew, some she recognized from Agnes's phone calls, some she had never met. People who had heard about the elevator through the particular small-town telegraph that needs no wires. A woman of about 40 came in late in the afternoon, alone, and stood looking at the notebook display. Agnes mounted on the wall, the archival copies of selected pages, the dates and the names, and her father's careful printing. The woman stood there for a long time. Vivian did not approach her. She understood now that sometimes a person needs a quiet place more than they need a conversation. Before she left, the woman found Vivian and said quietly that her grandmother's name was in one of the notebooks. 1979, a bad year. She said she had not known the full story. She said she was glad it had been written down. Vivian said she was glad too. She had not sold the elevator. She had not handed it to the county. She had done the thing her father had done, which was to hold it open for whoever needed it next, because an open door is not a passive thing. An open door is a decision made every morning. She still bookkeeps. Her client list has grown, slowly the way things grow when you stop trying to force them, and simply stay in one place long enough for people to find you. The furnace got replaced in December by a contractor named Gus, who had grown up 2 streets over and had known her mother and offered terms that were more generous than the invoice implied. She paid him in full by spring. The green lamp in the office burns on the evenings when Vivian is out at the elevator, which is more evenings than she expected when she first came back to Lacombe. She is not her father, she will never be her father, but she has learned his handwriting well enough to recognize it, which is not a small thing, and she has started keeping her own notebook, not in the third drawer but on the desk, where it is easier to reach. The first entry is dated the same week the heritage designation was confirmed. Vivian, keepers of the record following Harold Holt. Keep the door open. No one has to find their way alone. She set the pen down, looked out at the blind man running under the February ice, and understood at last that her father had not left her an empty building. He had left her a practice, something to do every day that was larger than herself and smaller than a sermon. Something that required only that she show up, and write down the names, and leave the door unlocked for whoever might need to come in out of the cold.